Hello everyone, and welcome back to Daily Kaylee's 13 Days of Halloween. I hope you all enjoyed my last episode. It was really long compared to my other Halloween episodes. I usually stick to smaller cases, and I had no idea how insanely detailed that case was until I began reading about it. And I'm really glad that I was able to share it with you all so that we all have a deeper understanding of Sylvia Likens and just bringing her case to light to share it with others. It was insane for me to read that. I think because I'm a mother, it's really hard for me to read about cases that involve young women. I don't know, maybe I'm just like becoming a softie, I don't know, but it was really hard for me to read that to you guys. So I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope it affected you the way it affected me, in a good way. I don't mean that to be mean or anything, but today's episode is one of my favorites. Today's episode is about Jeffrey Dahmer. I'm sure all of us at this point have heard of Jeffrey Dahmer. Fun fact, at my sister, who probably will not listen to this because she is all over the place, my name in her phone has been Jeffrey Dahmer with a little knife emoji for probably going on 3 years now. I wish I had, like, a huge, like, funny reason behind this, or, like, a weird story, but the only reason that is my nickname from her is because of my glasses and my blonde hair, which I don't have anymore. But looking back, I really did look a lot like Jeffrey Dahmer, so there's that. She also put the knife emoji next to his name because when I was a kid, I used to chase her with knives around the house. So all of us were either the sibling with the knife or the sibling running from the knife, and I was the one with the knife. Comment on this. I don't really know what to call it. If you're on Spotify, you can reply to my episode. So if you're listening on Spotify, comment and tell me which sibling you were. Did you have the knife, or were you running from the knife? Anyways, back to Jeffrey Dahmer, the real Jeffrey Dahmer. He is one of my favorite serial killers. I guess that's a kind of a weird thing to say, but he is the most interesting to me. I think that his, like, psychological background is really interesting. Let's just get into it. I'm sure you don't give a shit about why I think he's interesting. Anyways, Jeffrey Dahmer, growing up, he was the weird kid. He was very strange. He was quiet and just offbeat of everyone else. He lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Obviously, by the title of this episode, I'm sure you knew that. He was the first of 2 sons, so he had a younger brother. His dad was a chemistry student, and that is kind of an important detail in learning about Jeffrey Dahmer and his childhood. So, it is speculated, I mean, obviously no one knows everything about his home life or his childhood, but it is speculated that as a child, he did not receive a lot of attention as a baby and as a toddler, and that is why he kind of like flipped the switch as a kid, and he was really strange and didn't show a lot of emotions. But the reason that is speculated is not only his behavior, but because his mother was very intense. She was a huge attention hog. She needed all the attention. She was the type to start petty arguments with not only Jeffrey's dad, but also, like, the neighbors. It was just, she had some mental health issues that were not treated, and it caused her to act that way. While Jeffrey was a child, his mother, like I said, had awful mental health issues. Not only was she depressed, but just, she had a whole, like, list of things that she needed treated. But she stayed in bed a lot. She did not spend a lot of time with her sons. And because of that, his father was not able to give him the attention that he needed either, because he was having to focus on his crazy mother who needed help. As an adult, and obviously the authorities, like, interviewing him and doing studies, I mean, even as an adult, he recalled, like, all of the arguments and just the tension in his household from his parents. At first, Jeffrey was a normal kid, and his parents say that he had double hernia surgery right before he turned 4, and ever since then, something was just not right with him. He was not, like, energetic anymore. He was not outgoing. He wasn't just, like, the happy-go-lucky kid that, of course, a lot of us recognize in toddlers. They're always wanting to meet new people, make new friends, do new things. That was not the case with Jeffrey anymore. He became, like I said, quiet and shy, and he was just, like, the weird kid. I mean, he did not have many friends, and it was shortly after he entered the 1st grade. He gained a very strange interest in dead animals. At first, he would just, like, go outside and collect dead insects, like dragonflies, butterflies. He would pick up dead ones off the road, out of his yard, and he'd put them in jars just to, like, look at them in his house. After this, it kind of progressed to him finding, like, the carcasses of dead animals out in the woods by his house, and he would bring them home and dismember the dead animals. He would then take parts of these dead animal carcasses and put them in his family's tool shed. He told his friends that he was just interested in how, like, the animals were made up, like, how their body parts fit together, stuff like that. He was just very weird with his hobbies, I guess I should say. I don't really know how else to explain it. This was, like, his main hobby. This is what he wanted to do. This is what he spent most of his time outside of school doing, was just playing with animal bones. And it made him so happy, which is, like, I guess the most weird thing about it. Like, it wasn't like he was just doing this as an experiment. Like, he was deeply interested and thrilled to be doing this. This progressed to him not harming live animals, but he would approach live animals to just look at their bodies and, like, see where their bones were located, like which bone was which while they were alive. He was not harming these animals yet. When things got very serial killer-ish, there was the body of a dead dog in the woods near his home. He decapitated the carcass of the dog and then nailed the body to a tree. He then took the skull of the dog and impaled it with a stake next to this wooden cross that was, like I said, in the forest near his home. This is insane for a, like, grade school age child to be doing this. I don't know where the hell his parents were. I mean, like I said, he didn't get a lot of attention, but, like, Jesus Christ. Hold on one second. My lunch is coming out of the oven. Alright, guys. I ate my lunch, and now I'm back. So, back to what I was saying. In October of 1966, so Jeffrey was, he was 6 years old, I'm pretty sure. He might have been almost 7. But anyways, the family moved to Doylestown, Ohio, and this is when his mother gave birth to his younger brother. That same year, his father got his degree, and he began work as a chemist in Akron, Ohio. So, he was in a nearby town. 2 years later, they moved to Bath Township, which was in Summit County, Ohio. So, he was 8. 2 years after living there, so when Jeffrey was now 10, during dinner time, they were having chicken for dinner, and Jeffrey asked his dad what would happen if he put the chicken bones in bleach. His father was thinking that he was just interested in chemistry because that's what his father did. So, of course, he told him. He was happy that he was interested in chemistry because that's what he did for a living. So he told Jeffrey how to safely bleach the bones and how to preserve them. After this, Jeffrey began collecting more bones, and he now used these techniques to preserve them. This same year, his mother began increasing her daily consumption of medication that she was prescribed for her depression, and she was also prescribed sleeping pills. So she took more and more of these, which made her less and less of a capable mother, if that makes sense. She could not watch her children, and she just was not there for Jeffrey. In high school, Jeffrey was automatically seen as an outcast. He had little to no friends. He, like I said, was just the weird, quiet kid. By 14 years old, he had already begun drinking beer and, hard liquor during daylight hours. It was commonplace for him to be drinking. He would bring alcohol with him to school, and he would conceal it in his jacket. It is reported that one of his classmates in one of his morning history classes, asked him, why are you drinking alcohol in class? It's 8 a.m., what are you doing? And Jeffrey told him that alcohol was his medicine. So he was already fucked up at the age of 14. I mean, we knew that, but it's just insane, how much your home life can impact your childhood, which I'm sure we all know that, but it's insane. While he was in high school, he was a tennis player, and he was briefly in the high school band. He did not last in band class, but all of the staff members at his high school said that he was very kind and he was very smart, but his grades did not really reflect his intelligence because, like I said, he was more interested in his out-of-school activities than he was his class work. I don't know why I worded that so weird. Anyways, after Jeffrey reached the age of puberty, he realized that he was gay. He did not tell his parents, and he didn't tell really anyone that he knew either, just because, like I said, he didn't have a lot of friends, and the friends that he did have they were more like acquaintances. They weren't very close. He had a brief relationship with another teenage boy that he went to school with, and he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a completely submissive male partner. That is what he wanted. When Jeffrey was 16, he suddenly had this sexual fantasy of knocking out this jogger that passed his house. I don't really know how else to explain to him. This man would go on daily jogs, and his daily route passed Jeffrey's house. Jeffrey hid in the bushes with a baseball bat and was waiting for this man so that he could knock him out and then have sex with him, basically. However, the jogger did not pass his house that day. Later on, Jeffrey admitted that this was his first attempt to actually attack someone. So, like I said, Jeffrey was really weird, and he was pretty much a loner. But somehow he was the class clown, if that makes sense. He was always staging pranks, him and other kids. And one of these pranks that he had, the kids called it doing a Dahmer. And basically, he would pretend to have seizures as a joke, and they would do it in school and like at local stores throughout their community, just I guess just to gauge the reaction of the community. I don't know, it was really strange, but that was that. Now, in 1977, he was 17. His grades were terrible because, like I said, he was only focused on his extracurricular activities. He was not interested at all with school. His parents hired a private tutor, which failed because he wasn't paying attention. And this same year, his parents decided to attend marriage counseling because their marriage was just going downhill fast. It did not work, and they still continued to fight and bicker at home. Jeffrey's dad found out that his mother, Joyce, had an affair that September, so they both decided to go their separate ways and just get a divorce, not only for them, but for the kids, and they wanted to remain friends for their children. At first, his father moved out the following spring, and he stayed in a motel. Jeffrey graduated from high school in May of 1978, and right before he graduated, this was probably like a few weeks before the last day of school, one of his teachers saw him in the school parking lot drinking several cans of beer. The teacher threatened to report him, and Jeffrey told him that he was experiencing a lot of problems at home. That spring, Joyce and his younger brother moved out of the house to go live with relatives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and Jeffrey was now all alone in the home. He had just turned 18, and his entire family has abandoned him. Jeffrey's first murder took place the same year, 3 weeks after graduation and right after his mother and little brother moved out of the home. On June 18th, Jeffrey picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks. Sorry, I did not realize that Mark was not his last name. Anyway, Stephen Hicks, who was about the same age as Jeffrey. He was a little bit older and was about to turn 19 years old. Instead of taking Stephen to his location, he brought Stephen back to his home and convinced him to come inside on the pretext of like, hey, let's drink, let's have fun, I live here alone, shit like that. According to Jeffrey has admitted this in later interviews. He said that Stephen was bare-chested, he had no shirt on, standing on the side of the road, and that it stirred his sexual feelings. However, Stephen began talking about girls and how he was going to this rock concert, and Jeffrey knew that any sexual passes that he made at Stephen would not work. After several hours of drinking and just listening to music, Stephen wanted to leave and go to the concert, and Jeffrey did not want him to leave. Jeffrey bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound dumbbell. He hit him twice from behind, and he obviously fell unconscious. I mean, he was hit in the back of the head twice. After he was unconscious, Jeffrey strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell and then stripped his clothes from his body before he put it as exploring his chest with his hands. And then, although he did not do anything further to the body, he then masturbated as he stood above his corpse. The next morning, Jeffrey dissected his body in the basement and then buried the remains in a shallow grave in the family's backyard. After burying him, several weeks later, he dug up the remains so that he could get his bones, basically. He dissolved the remaining flesh in acid and then flushed the rest of it down the toilet. He then crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the forest behind his house. He was nothing if not prepared, I guess. 6 weeks after he murdered Stephen, Jeffrey's dad and his new fiance, that he did not know about, returned home, and they realized Jeffrey was living there alone and that he was still there, not with his mother. That August, Jeffrey decided to enroll at Ohio State University, and he was going to major in business. He only lasted 1 term at Ohio State, and it was very unproductive. He did not do well in school, and it's mainly because, he was an alcoholic. He abused alcohol throughout the entire term. He had failed grades, and he just was not very interested in trying to save his grade. So he dropped out. When he dropped out, his GPA was a 0.45 out of a 4.0. Which is, that has to break a record. He dropped out after 3 months, so he literally served 1 term. Not even a full year. It was insane. In January of 1979, his father was very persistent in trying to convince Jeffrey to enlist in the Army, so he did. He was trained as a medical specialist at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. He was deployed to West Germany in 1979, and he was a combat medic. I don't know how I got those two endings confused. According to reports, his first year of service, he was an above-average soldier. He was great. However, not even 2 years later, he was deemed unsuitable for military service, and he was discharged from the Army because he was an alcoholic, and because of this, his performance was not that great. He received an honorable discharge because he didn't think that any problems that he had in the Army would affect him in civilian life. So they discharged him honorably, and he was sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina to be debriefed from the Army, and he was provided a plane ticket, and they told him he could travel anywhere in the country. He decided to go to Miami Beach, and he just felt that he could not return home to face his dad after he had dropped out of school and then was discharged from the Army. He felt like a disappointment, and he also said that he was tired of the cold weather in Ohio. In Florida, he rented a room in a motel, and he spent most of his salary from his new job on alcohol. He was evicted from the motel because he couldn't pay, and at first he would literally just sleep on the beach, and he worked at a sandwich shop until finally he decided to call his dad and just asked if he could come home because, like I said, he was broke and he was miserable. His father obviously said yes, that was his son, of course he did. And at first he moved back in with his dad and his new stepmother. And he decided that since he was allowed to live there, he would do all the chores while he was looking for work. He was still drinking, which he at this point knew was causing all of these problems in his life, but he continued to drink, and not even 2 weeks after he returned home, he was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct. He was fined $60 and was given a suspended 10-day jail sentence. His father tried really hard to get him off of alcohol, and it was unsuccessful. It did not work at all. That December of 1981, Jeffrey's dad and his new stepmother sent him to live with his grandmother, who lived in West Allis, Wisconsin. It is reported that Jeffrey's grandmother is the only person in his family that he had any affection for. They hoped that maybe the change of scenery plus living with his grandmother and her influence would just help him quit drinking and help him find a job and do better for himself. At first, he was doing really well. He went with her to church, he took on all of her chores, he was actively looking for a job, and he followed all of her house rules. Besides drinking, he continued to drink, of course. At first, he was doing really well, like I said, and the following spring, he found employment as a phlebotomist. He was there for 10 months before he was laid off, and he was unemployed for over 2 years. At this point, the only income that he had was the money that his grandmother decided to give him. Right before he lost his job, he was arrested for indecent exposure on August 7th, 1982. He was at a park in Wisconsin, and there were 25 people, including women and children, present. He was convicted of this crime. Obviously, there was a lot of witnesses, and he was fined $50. Flash forward, January of 1985, Jeffrey was hired as a chocolate mixer at a chocolate factory in Milwaukee. He worked there overnight from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. He worked 6 nights a week, and he had Saturday night off. This is where things start to derail a little bit. I mean, he's already murdered someone, so I guess you can't really say they're derailing now, but they start to go downhill once again after he was at first doing a lot better. He was sitting in the West Allis Public Library, and he was reading, and a stranger, just a random man, threw him a note that offered to perform oral sex on Jeffrey. Jeffrey ignored the note and did not respond, but after this, he began fantasizing of the same thing, pretty much. And at this point is when his control started to slip. He began to be a frequent customer at different gay bars in Milwaukee. He apparently stole a male mannequin from a store, which he used for sexual stimulation until his grandma found it and demanded that he gets rid of it because she was like, what the hell is this? At first, Jeffrey was pleased to be having sexual encounters after never having them, I guess you could say. But he would get frustrated because he didn't want the partner to participate. He wanted them to stay still. He trained himself to view people as sexual objects instead of as actual people. Beginning the next year, in June of 1986, he started giving his partners sleeping pills, and he would lace their liquor with sedatives. They obviously had no idea this was happening. And then after they would fall asleep, he would rape them. In order to continue his supply, or to continue getting his supply of sleeping medication, he would tell his doctors that because he worked nights, he needed them just to be able to get his body to adjust to working his hours. And of course, they felt bad for him, and they continued to prescribe it to him. Jeffrey read a report in a local newspaper that was talking about the upcoming funeral of an 18-year-old boy who had passed away. He came up with this plan to steal the corpse and take it home. I study it. I don't really know what his plan was with that. According to Jeffrey, he tried to dig up the coffin from the ground, but the soil became too hard and he just gave up. On September 8th, 1986, Jeffrey was arrested because he was masturbating in the presence of two 12-year-old boys. He at first claimed that he had just been trying to use the bathroom and he didn't know that there were witnesses, but obviously he soon admitted to the offense. The charge was dropped to disorderly conduct and he was sentenced to 1 year of probation. That's pretty much it. He continued to get out of jail time. On November 20th, 1987, Jeffrey was still living with his grandmother, but he met a 25-year-old man named Stephen Tuomi, and they met at a bar. He persuaded this man to follow him to a nearby hotel, the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, and Jeffrey rented a room there for the night. Jeffrey said that he had no intention of murdering Stephen and that he just wanted to drug him and violate his body, pretty much. Jeffrey says that the next morning, he woke up to find Stephen laying beneath him on the bed, and that his chest seemed to be crushed in, and it was black and blue with bruises. There was blood coming out of the corner of his mouth, and Jeffrey's fist and one of his forearms were also extensively bruised. Jeffrey said that he had no memory of killing Stephen, and he's told investigators numerous times that he could not believe that this had happened. He obviously had to get rid of the body, and he bought a large suitcase, and this is where he stuffed Stephen's body to bring the body home with him from the hotel. A week later, at his grandmother's house, he severed the head, arms, and legs from the torso, and then he filleted the bones from the body before cutting the flesh into small pieces. He put the flesh inside plastic garbage bags, and he wrapped the bones with a sheet, and he pounded them with a sledgehammer until they were, crushed to bits, pretty much. After he dismembered him and crushed his bones, he just took all of these belongings and just threw them in the trash. Just threw them away like it was nothing. He kept his head for 2 whole weeks. He kept his head just wrapped in a blanket inside of his home. And after 2 weeks, he boiled the head in a mixture of Soilex, which is an industrial detergent, and bleach. He wanted to retain the skull and keep it intact so he could preserve it. He then used his skull as a way to stimulate himself for masturbation. Eventually, the skull was just too brittle to keep in his house, and he decided to pulverize it with a sledgehammer and get rid of it. After Stephen's murder, Jeffrey began to actively seek out people to kill, and a lot of these victims he found either inside gay bars or very close by. He would lure them back to his grandmother's home, and he would drug them with benzos. And he would rape them. Once he had them unconscious with the sleeping pills, he killed them by strangulation. 2 months after Stephen's murder, Jeffrey found 14-year-old Native American male prostitute named James Doxtator, and he lured him back to his grandmother's home. He offered James $50 to pose for nude pictures, and that was why he decided to follow him home, because he needed the money. At his grandmother's home, they engaged in sexual activity, and then Jeffrey drugged James and strangled him on the floor of his grandmother's cellar. Jeffrey left the body in the cellar for 1 week before dismembering it, and he did it in the exact same way that he did Stephen's body 2 months before. He put all of his remains in the trash like before, besides his skull. He then boiled and cleansed the skull in bleach, and 2 weeks later he pulverized it just like he did Stephen's. On March 24th, 1988, Jeffrey met a 22-year-old bisexual man named Richard outside a gay bar called the Phoenix. Jeffrey lured Richard back to his grandmother's house, per usual, and the incentive for Richard to follow him back was Jeffrey was going to pay him $50 to just spend the rest of the night with him. He then, of course, drugged Richard with sleeping pills and strangled him with a leather strap. And then Jeffrey performed oral sex on Richard's corpse. Jeffrey once again dismembered his body, crushed his bones, and then crushed his skull and threw it all in the trash. On April 23rd, Jeffrey lured another young man to his house, and he gave the victim a drugged coffee. But he and his intended victim both heard his grandmother call down the stairs and say, "Is that you, Jeff?" Because she didn't realize that he had come home. Jeffrey responded to try to make his grandmother think that he was alone, but she realized that he was not alone. Because of this, he decided not to kill this particular victim, and after he was unconscious, he took him to the nearby hospital to just get rid of him so he wouldn't remember anything. That September of 1988, Jeffrey's grandmother asked him to move out, mainly because he was still drinking and it was not a good environment for her. She also noted his habit of bringing young men to her house late at night and the awful smells that would come from the basement. Jeffrey found a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street, also in West Dallas, and he moved into his new apartment on September 25th. 2 days later, he was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy whom he had lured to his home on the pretense of posing for nude photographs. Jeffrey's father hired an attorney named Gerald Boyle to defend Jeffrey. At Boyle's request, Jeffrey underwent a series of psychological evaluations. These evaluations revealed that Jeffrey harbored deep feelings of alienation. He thought that he had been alienated by everyone in his community, his school, his family. A second evaluation 2 months later revealed that Jeffrey was impulsive. He was suspicious of others, and he was dismayed by his lack of accomplishments in life. In January of 1989, Jeffrey was convicted of second-degree sexual assault and of enticing a child for immoral purposes. On March 20th, Dahmer commenced a 10-day Easter absence from work, and he moved back into his grandmother's home. 2 months after his conviction and 2 months prior to his sentencing, Dahmer murdered his fifth victim. He was 24-year-old aspiring model Anthony Sears, and he met him at a gay bar on March 25th, 1989. According to Jeffrey, he was not intending to commit a crime on this occasion. However, shortly before closing time that evening, Anthony just started talking to him. Jeffrey decided to lure Anthony back to his grandmother's home, and they engaged in oral sex before Jeffrey drugged him and then strangled him. The following morning, Jeffrey put Anthony's corpse in his grandmother's bathtub, and he decapitated the body before attempting to dismember the corpse. He stripped the flesh from the body and pulverized the bones, and he once again disposed of these in the trash. According to Jeffrey, he found Anthony exceptionally attractive, and this makes Anthony the first victim from which Jeffrey permanently kept his body parts. He preserved Anthony's head and his genitalia in acetone and stored them in a wooden box, which he later put into his work locker. He moved to a new address the following year, and he took the remains with him. On May 23rd, 1989, Jeffrey was sentenced to only 5 years probation and 1 year in the House of Corrections, with work release permitted in order that he would hopefully be able to keep his job. He was also required to register as a sex offender. 2 months before his scheduled release, Jeffrey was paroled, and his 5 years probation was beginning now, if that made any sense to you. Once he was released, Jeffrey temporarily moved back in with his grandmother. And then in May of 1990, he moved into Oxford Apartments, which was located on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. It was a high-crime area. However, it was very close to his workplace, it was furnished, and it only cost him $300 per month with all of the bills included. So that was pretty good for him, especially in 1990. On May 14th, 1990, Jeffrey moved out of his grandmother's house and into the apartments officially. He took Anthony's head and genitals with him. And within a week or less of moving into his new apartment, he killed his sixth victim, which was a man by the name of Raymond Smith. Raymond was a 32-year-old male prostitute, and Jeffrey lured him back to the apartment with the promise of paying him $50 to have sex with him. Inside Jeffrey's apartment, he gave Raymond a drink that was laced with 7 sleeping pills, and then, like usual, he strangled him. The following day, Jeffrey purchased a Polaroid camera, and he returned to the apartment to take several pictures of Raymond's body in sexually suggestive positions before he dismembered him in the bathroom. He boiled Raymond's legs, arms, and pelvis in a steel kettle, and then he rinsed the bones in the sink. He dissolved the rest of Raymond's skeleton besides his skull in a container filled with acid. He kept his skull and then spray painted it, and he placed it alongside Anthony's skull, which he kept on a black towel inside of a metal filing cabinet. About 1 week after Raymond's murder, Jeffrey lured another young man to his apartment. On this occasion, Jeffrey accidentally drank the drink that he had laced with sedatives. When he awoke the next morning, he found that his intended victim had stolen several items of his clothing, a watch, and $300 in cash. He never reported this to the police for obvious reasons, but on May 29th, he told his probation officer that he had been robbed. In June of 1990, Jeffrey lured 27-year-old Edward Smith, who was an acquaintance of his, to his apartment. He drugged and strangled him. On this occasion, instead of immediately acidifying the skeleton and repeating any of the previous processes that he usually did, he took his skeleton and put it in the freezer for several months, and he hoped that it would not retain moisture. This did not work, and several months later, he acidified the skull because that was his only option at that point. He put the skull in the oven to dry, and this accidentally caused the skull to explode. According to Jeffrey, when he told police later about how he felt about Edward's murder, he only felt bad about it because he had been unable to retain any parts of his body. He told police, "It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, I at least could keep their skeletons." Less than 3 months after he murdered Edward, Jeffrey encountered a 22-year-old man named Ernest Miller. He met him outside of a bookstore, and Miller agreed to accompany Jeffrey to his apartment for $50, and he was going to make dinner for them. Basically, that was the gist of the evening. When Jeffrey attempted to perform oral sex on Miller told him that'll cost you extra, and he decided to lace his drink with sleeping pills. He only had 2 sleeping pills left, and this was not enough. He eventually killed Miller by slashing his artery with the same knife that he used to dissect his victims' bodies. He bled to death within a few minutes, and then he posed his body for, once again, suggestive photographs. He then put his body in the bathtub to dismember him. It is reported that Jeffrey repeatedly kissed and talked to the severed head while he dismembered the rest of his body. Jeffrey wrapped his heart, biceps, and portions of his legs in plastic and then placed them in the fridge for later consumption. He boiled his flesh and the rest of his organs into a jelly-like substance, and he intended to keep these. He placed the bones in a bleach solution to preserve them, and then he let them dry on a cloth for 1 week instead of putting them in the oven. He at first kept his severed head in the refrigerator, And then when he was ready, he took it out, stripped it of its flesh, and then painted and coated it with enamel. 3 weeks after the murder of Miller, on September 24th, Dahmer met a 22-year-old man named David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall. He persuaded him to return to his apartment with him for a few drinks, and he gave him additional money if he would pose for photographs. Apparently, according to Dahmer, he told the police this. He said that after he gave David a drink laced with sedatives, he did not feel attracted to him anymore. But he was afraid to let him wake up in case he would be angry after he was drugged. Because of this, he strangled him and dismembered his body, and he kept no parts of his body at all. He did not want to keep anything because, like I said, he was not attracted to him. He photographed the dismemberment process and kept the photographs. After the murder of David Thomas, he did not kill anyone for 5 months. However, between October of 1990 and February of 1991, he unsuccessfully tried to lure different men to his apartment, and it just didn't work for him. In February of 1991, Jeffrey saw a 17-year-old named Curtis Straughter standing at a bus stop near the university that was near his home. According to Jeffrey, he lured Curtis into his apartment with the same ruse of offering money if he will pose for nude photos. He drugged Curtis, cuffed his hands behind his back, and then strangled him to death with a leather strap. He dismembered him, kept his skull, hands, and genitals, and then photographed each stage of the dismemberment process. Less than 2 months later, on April 7th, Jeffrey encountered 19-year-old Errol Lindsay, and he was walking to get a new key for his apartment. Lindsay was straight. That's important. Jeffrey brought him back to his apartment, and he drugged him. He drilled a hole into his skull and poured in hydrochloric acid. According to Jeffrey, Lindsay woke up after this experiment. And apparently Jeffrey's plans for this experiment was that this would keep him in a unresponsive, submissive state. However, that obviously didn't work. Lindsay, when he woke up, said, "I have a headache. What time is it?" In response to this, because he was not unresponsive and submissive, he once again drugged Lindsay, and then he strangled him. He decapitated Lindsay, and he kept his skull. Then he stripped the flesh off of Lindsay's body and got rid of his bones, as usual. He took some of his skin and put it in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks in the hopes that it would preserve the skin. However, it did not work. By 1991, multiple of Jeffrey's neighbors of the Oxford apartment building had been repeatedly complaining to the building manager because there were awful smells coming from apartment 213, which is where Jeffrey lived. They also heard sounds of falling objects often, and they would also sometimes hear a chainsaw, which is obviously from him dismembering the body. He always had an excuse for the foul smells. At first, he said that his freezer was broken, and all of the meat he had in the freezer was then spoiled, and that was the smell. Later, he would say that he had tropical fish, and they had all recently died, and that he was going to have to get rid of them. On May 26, 1991, Jeffrey met 14-year-old teenager named Conorak Synthesymphone. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. Jeffrey did not know this, but Conorak was the younger brother of the boy that he had molested in 1988. He offered the little boy, well, I won't say little boy, he was 14, so he was a teenager. He offered him money to come back with him to his apartment and pose for pictures. According to Jeffrey, Conorak was at first very reluctant, and then he decided to change his mind last minute, and he came with him. He posed for pictures in his underwear, and then Jeffrey drugged him and performed oral sex on him. He experimented again, and he drilled a hole into his skull, and he put hydrochloric acid into his frontal lobe. Before Conorak fell unconscious, Jeffrey brought the boy into his bedroom, and the body of 31-year-old Tony Hughes, who Jeffrey had killed 3 days prior, was laying naked on the floor. According to Jeffrey, he did believe that Conorak saw the body, but he did not react to seeing the corpse there. He thought it was probably because of the sleeping pills that he had given him, and, of course, the hydrochloric acid that had been injected into his skull. Conorak was unconscious, and Jeffrey decided to lay beside him on the bed and drink several beers before he made the probably not very bright decision to leave the apartment and go drink at a bar. In the early morning of May 27th, Jeffrey returned to his apartment, and he discovered Conorak sitting naked on the corner of the street, talking to 3 distressed women who were standing near him. He told the women that Conorak was his friend and that he attempted to lead him back to the apartment. However, the young women told Jeffrey that they had already called 911 so that they should stay where they are. Upon the arrival of the police, Jeffrey relaxed, and he told the officers that Conorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that he had drank too much following an argument that they had, and that this was typical behavior of Conorak. The 3 women were, in disbelief, and one of them tried to show the officers that, oh my God, how am I going to put this? She did not know to the extent that Conorak was injured, but she just knew that this didn't seem right, and she tried to get the officers to check him out further. They obviously thought he was intoxicated because of the way he was acting, because he'd been drugged. Anyways, the woman tried to indicate to the officers that this did not seem right. Conorak was trying to struggle away from Jeffrey while he was trying to walk him back to his apartment. However, the officer believed Jeffrey and told her to just mind her own business, pretty much. Shortly after the police got there, because they called 911, 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department showed up too. They also examined him just to make sure that he was fine. One of the 3 members of the fire department thought that Conorak probably needed treatment and needed to be taken to the hospital, but the police officers just told the fire department employees to just leave. Everything was fine, they'd handled it. 2 of the officers escorted Jeffrey and Conorak back to Jeffrey's apartment, and Jeffrey was trying to just derail the conversation and take all of the topic of interest off of him, if that makes any sense. He kept commenting on the crime in the neighborhood and how appreciative he was of the police, and just being a huge bootlicker to make them leave him alone, pretty much. Once inside his apartment, he was once again trying to convince the police that there was nothing to be worried about. He showed the officers the 2 Polaroid pictures that he had taken of Conorak that evening, just to corroborate his story that this was his boyfriend and that they lived together, and just being weird and over the top. One of the officers later said that he noticed a strange smell coming from the apartment, the smell was the decomposing body of the man that he killed a few days ago. But one of the other officers decided to investigate, in quotes, this odor. And the way that they investigated it was they just peeked his head around the bedroom and didn't, even take a good look. They did not see his body laying on the floor, and they said it was fine. This incident was then listed as a domestic dispute by the police. So he once again evaded that somehow. I don't know how he's so good at it, but once again, he evaded jail time. After the officers left and just brushed off this incident, Jeffrey injected hydrochloric acid into Connor Rock's brain again. After having it injected a second time, it was fatal and he died. The next day, on May 28th, Jeffrey took a sick day from work, and the whole day was spent dismembering not only Connor Rock, but also the body of the man that he murdered 3 days before. He kept both of their skulls. On June 30th, Jeffrey traveled to Chicago, and he met a 20-year-old man named Matt Turner at a bus station. Matt agreed to accompany Jeffrey on his travel back to Milwaukee, and the pretense of him even offering Matt to come home with him was that he was going to give Matt a professional photo shoot. Once back at the apartment, Jeffrey drugged, strangled, and dismembered Matt and placed his head and all of his internal organs in separate plastic bags in the freezer. Matt was never reported missing. 5 days later, on July 5th, Jeffrey lured 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger from a Chicago bar back to his apartment, and this time his ruse was that they could just spend the weekend together. He drugged Jeremiah twice and then injected boiling water through his skull, which put him into a coma, and he died 2 days later. On July 15th, Jeffrey met 24-year-old Oliver Lacey. Oliver agreed to come back to Jeffrey's apartment and pose for nude photographs. They engaged in sexual activity, and then Jeffrey, of course, drugged Oliver. This time, Jeffrey's plan was to prolong the time that he was going to spend with Lacey while he was still alive. He tried to keep Oliver unconscious with chloroform, and this was kind of unsuccessful because he didn't really know what he was doing. He called his workplace to request another day's absence, and they allowed it. However, the next day they suspended him. After strangling Oliver, Jeffrey had sex with his corpse before dismembering him. He put Oliver's head and his heart in the refrigerator and then put his skeleton in the freezer. 4 days later, on July 19th, Jeffrey received the news that he was fired and not only suspended. After he got this phone call, he went out and he met 25-year-old Joseph Braidhoft, and he brought him back to his apartment. Joseph was strangled, and his body was just left on Jeffrey's bed covered with a sheet for 2 days. On July 21st, Jeffrey removed the sheet, and he found that Joseph's head was covered in maggots, and this is when he decided to decapitate the body. He cleaned his head, removed all the removed all the maggots, and then put his head in the refrigerator. He acidified Joseph's torso along with the other 2 victims that he had killed that month. The ones that he had all of their body parts just in plastic bags and stored in his fridge and his freezer. On July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey approached 3 men, and he offered them $100 to come back with him to his apartment to pose for nude photographs. One of the men, who was 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to come back with him. Whenever they entered Jeffrey's apartment, Tracy noted the awful odor that was coming from the entire apartment, and he also noticed the several boxes of hydrochloric acid that he had just strewn around the apartment. They had just, like, casual conversation, and Jeffrey requested that Tracy turn his head so that he could see his tropical fish, which he did not even have. When Tracy turned his head, Jeffrey put a handcuff on his wrist. When Tracy asked what's happening, he told Tracy to come back with him to the bedroom to pose for the new photos. While he was inside the bedroom, Tracy took note of what the location looked like. He noted that there were nude male posters on the wall. A videotape of The Exorcist was playing, and that there was a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner, and a strong odor was coming from it. Jeffrey took out a knife and once again informed Tracy that he is taking nude photos of him. He was trying to calm Jeffrey down, so Tracy unbuttoned his shirt and said that he would play along if Jeffrey would remove the handcuffs and put the knife down. Jeffrey was contemplating what to do. Tracy observed that Jeffrey just turned his attention towards the TV, and he was, like, rocking back and forth before he turned his attention back to Tracy, and that's when he made his decision. He put his head on Edward's chest. He listened to his heartbeat, and then he had the knife pressed against Tracy, and he informed Tracy that he intended to eat his heart. He obviously was trying to prevent Jeffrey from attacking him, so he kept saying that he was Jeffrey's friend and he was not going to run away. Like, he wants to just talk it out. Tracy decides that he is going to either jump from the window or run through the front door whenever he has the next opportunity. Tracy said that he needed to use the bathroom, and he said that when he's done, can they go sit in the living room and drink some beer because there was air conditioning and he would feel better. Jeffrey agreed, and whenever Tracy came out of the bathroom, they went to the living room. Obviously, I don't know why I paused, like that was not obvious. Once they were in the living room, Tracy waited until he noticed that Jeffrey was having, like, a weird internal lapse of concentration. Like, he was trying to think of something else. So he asked if he could use the bathroom again, because he knew that Jeffrey probably would not remember. When Tracy stood up to go to the bathroom, he noticed that Jeffrey was not holding the handcuffs anymore. Tracy punched Jeffrey in the face and ran out the front door. At 11:30 p.m. on July 22nd, Tracy flagged down 2 police officers. They noticed that he had one handcuff attached to his wrist, and he explained to the officers that a freak, talking about Jeffrey, had placed the handcuffs upon him and asked if the police could remove them. The officers' handcuff keys did not fit the handcuffs, so Tracy agreed to show the officers where the apartment was and told them about how he had spent the past 5 hours, like, trying to escape. When the officers and Tracy arrived back at the apartment, Jeffrey invited them all inside and admitted that he did put the handcuffs on Tracy, but he did not explain why he had done so. At this point, Tracy told the officers that Jeffrey had brandished a large knife upon him and, like, all that had happened in the bedroom. Jeffrey made, once again, like, no comment. He did not admit it nor deny it. He told one of the officers that the key to the handcuffs was in his bedside dresser. The officers entered the bedroom, and one of the officers noted that there was a huge knife underneath his bed. Once he was in the bedroom, he obviously went to the bedside table so that he could get the handcuff keys, and he saw another open drawer which had all of his Polaroid pictures. when he looked at the pictures, he noticed that almost all of them were of human bodies being dismembered. And when he looked closer, he noticed that these pictures were taken in Jeffrey's apartment. Like, these were real photos. When Jeffrey saw that the officers had his Polaroids, he fought with them trying to resist arrest. But there were two of them and one of him, and they overpowered him and arrested him. When the officers opened the refrigerator, they saw a freshly severed head on the bottom shelf. Upon further investigation by the Milwaukee Police Department, they found 4 severed heads in his kitchen, 7 skulls, and they also collected blood drippings that they found on a tray at the bottom of his refrigerators. They also found 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle wrapped in plastic bags in the freezer. Also in the freezer, they found an entire torso and a bag of human organs. They investigated the rest of the apartment and found 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp, and in the 57-gallon drum that was noticed earlier, they found 3 dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. They found 74 total Polaroid pictures that detailed the dismemberment process that Dahmer used on his victims. Whenever the chief medical examiner did an interview later on, he said it was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. Jeffrey confessed. He waived his right to a lawyer, and he admitted to murdering 16 young men in Wisconsin since 1987. And he said he had one further victim, which was Stephen Hicks, who was killed in Ohio back in 1978. He also admitted to engaging in necrophilia with several of his victims' bodies, which we knew, and he walked the police through his dismemberment process. Jeffrey said that he was completely swept along with his compulsion to kill, and that it was just like a desire to be with someone, no matter the cost. Jeffrey was, of course, charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder on July 25th, 1991. Less than a month later, he had been charged with an additional 11 murders committed in Wisconsin. On September 14th, investigators in Ohio had uncovered hundreds of bone fragments in the forest behind Jeffrey's family home. And they were able to identify Stephen Hicks and charged him with that murder as well. They obviously did mental evaluations, and they could not determine that he was insane, basically. They could not determine that his mental health had any say in the murders that he committed. Because of this, Jeffrey was convicted of all charges. and he was sentenced to life in prison plus 10 years for the first 2 counts of murder. The other 13 murders gave him a sentence of also life in prison plus 70 years. After he was sentenced to this, 3 months later, he had to be extradited to Ohio because of the murder of Stephen Hicks. Once again, Dahmer was sentenced to life in prison, and that would make 16 life terms that he had been sentenced to. On the morning of November 28th, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer left his jail cell because he had assigned work. 2 fellow inmates were accompanying him. One was Jesse Anderson and one was Christopher Scarfer. These 3 inmates were left unsupervised in the showers of the prison gym for about 20 minutes. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Jeffrey was discovered on the floor of the bathrooms, and he had extreme head wounds. He had been bludgeoned on his face and his head with a 20-inch metal bar. His head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall. Although Jeffrey was still alive while he was being rushed to a hospital, he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. Anderson had also been beaten with the same instrument, and he died 2 days later from his wounds. And that's really the end of Jeffrey Dahmer. Once his family learned about his death, they had mixed reactions. His mother was very angry that people were celebrating his death, and it was just really strange because she was not there for him his entire life, and now she was advocating for him. The victims' families were very pleased with his death, and they thought that they had received justice. Obviously, Christopher Scarver was sentenced to 2 additional terms of life in prison because he killed Jeffrey and Jesse Anderson. But that is the end of Jeffrey Dahmer. We do not need to get into Christopher Scarver. I'm sure he was in prison for a very justifiable reason. But I hope you guys liked this episode. This one is also a bit longer than normal. But I hope that I went into enough detail for you guys about the life and crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer. He, like I said, is one of the most interesting serial killers to me just because of his psychological background. Once again, if you are listening on Spotify, let me know if you guys were the sibling with the knife or the sibling running from the knife. I'll see you guys in a couple days, and I hope you guys enjoy. Bye.